Well, I'd like to introduce both of our ambassadors today, and then I think kindly make some remarks, and then we'll open it up to discussion. I guess we'll start with in alphabetical order. Richard Boucher.
No, it's not.
No? No? Seriously?
I defer to my seniors.
All right.
Yeah, well,
He's my
Right.
superior.
Ambassador Chaz Freeman is well, first of all, I should say, not only do we have these two distinguished ambassadors here, they are both senior fellows at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. So that's, just seeing the movie, I mean, it's one thing to watch a film about diplomacy, and it's an entirely different thing to have actual diplomats here and as part of the Watson Institute. So we're very privileged and very lucky that we're going to be able to hear from them. Ambassador Chaz Freeman is a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense, ambassador to ambassador to Saudi Arabia during Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm, acting Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, chargé d'affaires at both Bangkok and Beijing. He began his diplomatic career in India, but he specialized in Chinese affairs. He was the principal American interpreter during President Nixon's historic visit to Beijing in 1972. Ambassador Freeman studied in Mexico and in Taiwan. He earned his undergraduate degree, magna cum laude, at Yale, and he has a JD from Harvard Law School. He's the author of several books. We don't have time to go into them all. His most recent book was this year, America's Continuing Misadventures in the Middle East. He's also the author of Interesting Times, China, America, and the Shifting Balance of Prestige, America's Misadventures in the Middle East. And these are only a few of the many publications, but I'll just say that basically Ambassador Freeman is the proverbial dictionary entry because he is the editor of the Encyclopedia Britannica's entry on diplomacy. So we'll start with Ambassador Freeman. Thank you very much.
thanks. I don't want to go on very long because I imagine there are questions. That's actually the first time I've seen that film, although I saw an excerpt or two. I think it's a very useful film, particularly because we live in a country that is essentially diplomatically illiterate. We do not teach statecraft and diplomacy at really any level in a practical way here, and we have a highly militarized foreign policy. I remember a story that Newt Gingrich told me once. Where he had engineered the Republican onslaught in the mid-'80s and was picking up a congressman who had been reelected for the first time in St. Louis, and asked this fellow on the plane back to D.C., what are your priorities? What do you think the national priorities should be? And the Congress critter ran off a whole series of things, beginning with a strong national defense. And Gingrich, who is a very bright man, as well as other things, asked him, would you think Mexico is going to invade the United States? Or who are we defending against? And he said, basically, we don't have a defense department. We have an offense department, and its job is to manage our foreign relations through military deployments. And to a great extent, that does, unfortunately, sum up much of our approach to the world these days. If you ask people, even in the White House transition teams, and I've seen about 6 of them, what diplomats do, they don't know. What an ambassador does, the people who appoint ambassadors have no idea what an ambassador does and no way of matching qualifications to jobs, therefore. I'm reminded of and I think the film at the end correctly referred to this problem. The United States is the only country that now appoints a significant percentage of political appointees to diplomatic positions. This is an old American tradition, and I recall the words of the editorial in the New York Herald Tribune in 1867 commenting on a nominee to an ambassadorial position, and they said, diplomacy is the sewer through which flows the scum and refuse of the political puddle. A man not fit to stay at home is just the man to send abroad. There is a long tradition, and despite the fact that empirically it generally doesn't work out terribly well for the country, we continue to honor it. Why do people not know much about diplomacy? First of all, the word itself is used in many different contexts. It means, in a sense, foreign policy. Interactions with foreign governments, primarily foreign peoples, on behalf of the United States or another government. And it means, to a professional diplomat, what I would call deep diplomacy. That is, contriving circumstances in which another country does what you want it to do because it concludes that's in its interest. And you don't force that country to do anything, but you create circumstances where they make choices, the ones that you want them to make. But most diplomacy is successful when it precludes bad outcomes. And you can never prove that something that might have happened would have happened unless you intervened and changed the circumstances. So a great deal of diplomacy's success is, by definition, not only invisible but undemonstrable. Also, diplomacy is largely devoted, whether it's commercial diplomacy, opening markets, and I can tell you some interesting stories about that, as I'm sure Richard can as well, or it's negotiating. I was very involved at the beginning of the opening of the relationship with China, personally negotiated or participated in negotiating 36 treaties and agreements with the Chinese. A very instructive experience indeed in terms of very good negotiators on the other side. But you are engaged in facilitating interactions, building relationships. You're not engaged in transactions. And this is going to be interesting with the Trump administration, which is very transactional in its approach. You're engaged when you negotiate an agreement. You're not only engaged in negotiating that agreement, you're engaged in negotiating a relationship that will enable the implementation of that agreement and that will facilitate further agreement. And if you approach it as a sort of one-off transaction of the sort that you might have if you went to Morocco and went to the souk and engaged in bargaining, and both sides were determined to screw the other and you didn't care, then you would find that in diplomacy that was a bit of a problem. And finally, of course, a major job of diplomats, as I think Frank Wisner said in the film, is trying to head off or preclude or avoid emotional or bloody confrontations with other countries, and to use measures short of war, short of the use of force, to persuade them that they should do things the way we think they should, but not tell them that they're obeying our will, because if you tell them that, they won't. I think in many respects, the 1924 Rogers Act, which was referred to in the film, was a noble experiment that has so far failed. And it has failed for the very reason that was mentioned, namely the spoils system. If the qualification, and why do people want to be ambassadors? So there was a famous statement by the late Philip Habib, who was a Lebanese American who was ambassador to Korea and assistant secretary for East Asia, and for a while the Middle East peace envoy. And he said, well, that's easy. He said, if you're ambassador, when you walk down the Paul, everybody wants to kiss your ass. So that was his explanation for why people wanted to be ambassadors. But since we don't have titles of nobility in the United States, under the Constitution they're prohibited, gaining the title of ambassador is the next best thing. And so many people are into this for the prestige that attaches to the title. And there is prestige. One final comment. Diplomacy is scholarship without footnotes. It is a profession in which you must learn other languages, you must learn other people's history, you must find a way to empathize, not necessarily sympathize, but empathize with their perspective on the world. And the difference with scholarship is this is applied. All of the things that you are learning are for the practical purpose of not just understanding, not just analyzing, not just reporting on what is happening, but changing it. Now, sometimes we become overly specialized, as indeed scholars do. In fact, I think over-specialization is a major impediment to our understanding of the world, and in bureaucracy, it is a major impediment to effectiveness. When Henry Kissinger was Secretary of State, he therefore instituted a program called the Global Outlook Program. He was disturbed when he found that there were people who specialized in Japan, who knew Japanese, and who spent their whole careers going between Washington, Fukuoka, Nagasaki, Kyoto, Tokyo, and whatnot, Naha and Okinawa, and so or Sapporo and Hokkaido. So the Global Outlook Program, which of course promptly became known as GLOP, and became a verb. One got glopped. You were comfortably dealing with Germany, and suddenly you had to learn Arabic and do something in the Arab world to broaden your perspective. So, in many ways, the Foreign Service has been a success in terms of producing a cadre of people who are very bright, very capable, very dedicated to the country, and able and willing to take risks that politicians won't. But in other respects, we are short of what the Rogers Act envisaged.
Well, let me introduce
Sure.
Ambassador Richard Boucher, senior U.S. diplomat turned teacher, luckily for the Watson Institute. Over a 30-year career, he reached the highest rank in the Foreign Service, career ambassador. His early assignments were in China, later in Hong Kong during the transition from the British to the Chinese sovereignty. Much of his career was spent as spokesman for 6 secretaries of state. Later, he took on responsibilities for Afghanistan and Pakistan as Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asia. Based on his experience as an economic officer, an ambassador and spokesman and senior State Department official, Ambassador Boucher teaches policymaking from all angles. His 4 years as Deputy Secretary General of the OECD allows him to integrate economic developments very much into his courses as well. Thank you for speaking with us today.
Thank you very much, Joanne. I just want to make a couple comments and get on to questions, but a few things. I don't think I've ever tried to correct Chaz Freeman before, but
Go ahead.
I'm going to do it now. America doesn't teach diplomacy. You can't go anywhere to learn the practice of diplomacy unless you come
here.
to Watson
Brown.
and take courses from one of us.
Well
Or
done.
Brian Atwood.
Yeah.
So it's something good for Watson. And I don't want to correct Phil Habib, but I have to add that if you're ambassador these days, there are a lot of people who want to kiss your ass, and the other part there's
Shoot
a
you.
lot of people who want to shoot you.
Yeah, it's true.
So it is kind of a different world in many ways that we're trying to do this in. And I think the film in this respect was very good. It gave a good sense of the risk, good sense of the dangers, good sense of the work, and different aspects of the work. And I think of the issues and how the work and the issues are changing in a more networked world. It is a different task now than it has been before. I think it's a little less about the mission, and Chaz got into some of this, and I want to talk a little bit about the mission too, that the mission is to solve problems without resort to force. And the United States often threatens force, but the goal of diplomacy is to use that America's economic and military power with a active diplomacy to solve problems without resort to force and without resort to war. In too many cases, we're seen only as the cleanup brigade after the war's over, but most of the time we're trying to solve things without the application of force. You maintain contacts, you maintain ties to get information, to promote U.S. goals and values, and try to shape the situation, try to shape the evolution of events. If you want to see how it's done well, read the Wall Street Journal story about Robin Rayfeld, who was investigated by the FBI extensively for basically doing her job and getting out and talking to people in Pakistan. And that's the kind of misunderstanding we face in the United States, but also, frankly, among some of our brother and sister agencies. We go to dangerous places before the military arrives, and we stay there after they're gone. So we have, I think both of us, seen a lot of very dangerous spots and a lot of colleagues in dangerous places that serve there. So the question that's in front of me now, if diplomacy has to lead and these other things have to be sort of supporting forces, is who leads the strategy? And that's where I think I have a problem with some of the appointments being made now, not as individuals, a few of the individuals, but too many military people I don't think is good, because I think there's a different mindset, and that's kind of what bothers me, that they military are consistently sort of, how do we overcome this challenge? And I think diplomacy is much more about shaping the course of events, managing events until you can find an opening to push through a solution. One of my friends at the War College says military are taught to break the problem and then try to solve it, whereas we're taught to manage the problem until you can find a breakthrough. So that, to me, is a sort of fundamental aspect of diplomacy that's overlooked too often. And that mission and that approach are something we're going to need in the world. Now, the other thing that bothers me these days is I'm seeing more and more signs that the world is thinking about how to get along without us.
Mm.
You see the new president of the Philippines cutting deals with China in the South China Sea. You see people in other parts of the world looking at what are their options. One blogger that I like to read, a young Indian guy, wrote a very interesting story about how India should deal with China in a post-American world, quote unquote. I don't like the idea of a post-American world, but I think there are a lot of people out there that are thinking about it. And we've got to be out there, we've got to be part of it, and that's where diplomacy comes in. We can shape the world if we're out in it. We can manage the big problems if we're facing up to them. We can lead from the front if we're at the front. And we can influence people's behavior if we're there for what we call the last 3 feet. Shaking hands and talking to people and finding in what they want something that we want. So I think we need to be out there, and if we're not out there, others will be. And that fundamentally has to be our approach to many of the problems we're facing these days. So with that, happy to take questions, big, little, whatever.
Well, the first question will be from me.
Okay?
Take my prerogative for first minute. I wonder if either or both of you would have any comment on the role of technology and how that's changed the work of the Foreign Service. The film touched on it a bit with Twitter democracy, but there's cybersecurity, there's just the internet maybe in general, and maybe you could extend the film for us a little bit with some comment.
I'll start. There is a Ghanaian diplomatic colleague who said that the radio enabled people to hear all evil. Television enabled them to see all evil, and the airplane allows them to go and do all evil. And in fact, technology, of course, is fundamentally altering the nature of international interactions. And it's not just in the cyber area. So I think the question, for example, of I've lost the train of thought. The question of the use of social media to foment revolution, which was lauded in the film, probably wouldn't be lauded these days because it turned out that the mob rule in Tahrir Square and elsewhere did not produce what liberal ideology predicted. But the fact is that there is both an enormous explosion in the diffusion of information and narrowing at the same time of the information that is conveyed, because the social media, by definition, do not provide challenges to existing views. They reinforce one's existing knowledge and prejudices. The advent of email makes disciplined communication within a bureaucracy extremely difficult. The use of secure telephones is now ubiquitous, and there's no record of oral proceedings. So, for example, on one occasion, when I was ambassador to Riyadh, I reported that the Minister of Defense and Aviation was insistent on buying a certain kind of aircraft, and I immediately got a phone call from somebody close to the Secretary of State who said, please change that report and say that he doesn't want the plane. And my response was, you know, if you want someone who writes stuff you like to hear, get somebody else out here, because I'm going to tell it like it is. So the telephone, emails, various informal methods of communication, among other things, destroy the record. There is no record. And people don't want to write things because they know, as Mrs. Clinton has found out, that, you know, they hang around for a while and they can come back to bite you. That brings me, of course, to the final thing, which is WikiLeaks. How on earth can you do diplomacy with someone where the communication must be confidential and the other side can have no confidence that what he or she is telling you in confidence, or how they are reacting, or your impression of them will be kept quiet? A lot of complications, and of course a lot of benefits. You don't have to write in telegraphese anymore. Big changes.
You know, Ross Perot said we could replace all our embassies with fax machines. So I don't think it's a brand new issue, but I don't think any of us really understand how the technology is changing our relationships and our lives in ordinary life. There are things you can do with the technology in terms of social movements, in terms of getting a message out, in terms of, you know, contacting somebody in a dangerous place, in terms of finding the Americans in a place where you're trying to evacuate them from. So there are a lot of things you can do with the technology. I don't think we've understood them all, but I have to
Right.
say I'm a believer in living and breathing human beings, that human contact is the first thing, and is the first way to talk to people, understand people, and figure out what you can do together. And yes, once you have that relationship, you can do some of your business over the phone or the fax machine or email. But until you have that relationship, you can't just send somebody a note and saying, you know, please adopt the following regulations on baby carriages, or, you know, we like to use your port to mountain invasion. You gotta talk to people, and I think that's true in our own lives as well.
Somebody the other day said signals intelligence, which is essentially eavesdropping of various sorts on electronic media, means that diplomacy is no longer required. To which, because you can tell what people are thinking, supposedly, to which my retort would be, maybe you know some of the things they're thinking, but you're not in a position to ask them why they're thinking that. You're not in a position to argue with them that they should think something else. You're not in a position to correct their misimpressions. You're not in a position to negotiate with them about some way of harmonizing their view with your own. And this is the last 3 feet, and it's essential. And it really disturbs me, and it's referred to in the film, the extent to which we have built what I call crusader castles, fortress embassies, in which people are essentially locked up and not allowed to go out by our own security people. When I ran the American Embassy in Beijing, I remember vividly Jay Taylor, whom you know, of course, Richard, who was a very gifted political counselor working for me, would go in the afternoon through his political section. I think he had 5 or 6 officers, some doing reporting on foreign relations and some on domestic Chinese politics. And if he saw somebody there reading a newspaper, he would say, "Get out. If you can't make an appointment to see a Chinese official, go sit in the park and talk to people. Because the only value you add is that you're here and you're in touch with people. They can read newspapers in Washington, and they do. But I really think this is fundamental, and we've lost a great deal because of the enclosure of our diplomatic staff."
I'm going to stand to take some, make sure I can see the questions. I know that we have some Foreign Service officers in the room and a lot of interested public, so let's open up the floor. Who has, please?
So, just during like the end of the film there, and what you were saying at the end of Master, seems like, you know, to me, you know, at one point you could say Rome was the most powerful force in the world in, like, you know, 2,000 years ago. Then maybe British Empire or something, better for worse. Now maybe America is the most powerful country. Like, what do you think would bring the end of that? Or
Well, we're seeing part of the end of that right now, with nothing happening except an election and a 73-day interlude between the election and an inauguration. Because, for example, mentioned in the film again, the victor in the election has declared that climate change is a Chinese hoax intended to help deindustrialize America, perhaps having second thoughts now after meeting Al Gore and so forth. The recent COP22 meeting in Marrakesh in Morocco was one in which the Chinese emerged as the leaders of the people to whom people look for initiatives to address issues of climate change. In Lima, Peru, there was an APEC, Asia-Pacific Economic Community meeting, and because TPP has been kneecapped by American populism, again, the Chinese were looked to as the drivers of further trade and investment liberalization. Many people are now pointing to Germany as the exemplar of democracy, civil and human rights, and the champion of that, of those ideas, having grasped the baton from a faltering United States. I share Richard's disquiet at the extent to which we are, without doing very much except thrashing about internally, slipping in influence. And I think President Trump's going to inherit a very different world on January 20th than the one in which he was elected, simply because of the slippage.
Another question, please?
Well, there's so many things I could ask you at this point. Every day, there's something else about this administration that has really frightened me. What did you, Ambassador Freeman, as a Chinese expert, think about the phone call that between the president-elect and Taiwan, and what would you imagine, or did you speak to the ambassador in China to see what he was dealing with that day?
No, I did not get myself involved in this one. Richard also knows a good deal about this, and he may want to comment too. But I'd say, first of all, this phone call was, of course, prearranged between transition staff, probably on the inspiration of Ed Filner, who is the head of the Heritage Foundation, and other people, many of whom want to essentially relitigate the normalization of relations with China. They believe that we are treating our friends in Taiwan in an unseemly fashion, not recognizing their democracy and high standard of civil rights, which are both a fact, and would like to see us dispense with what I call constructive hypocrisy, which is a great tool of diplomacy. And in the law, legal fictions have their role too. So let's back up here. You have a group of people who are very purposeful. They know what they want to do, and they used President-elect Trump to advance this cause. Whether he understood what use he was being put to or not is an open question. The Chinese, for their part, played this, I think, very skillfully. That is, they said, well, Tsai Ing-wen, the ruler, the president, the leader in Taiwan, initiated the call. She certainly knew what she was doing, even if Mr. Trump didn't, and we're going to punish her. And we have an open mind about whether Mr. Trump knew what he was doing or not, and we're going to wait and see. Which is actually, in terms of the management of U.S.-China relations, a very constructive instance of hypocrisy on their part, because I think they fear the worst. But it doesn't get us immediately into an emotional confrontation. I have to say that the press coverage of this issue has been appalling in its lack of understanding of what is at stake. People talk about a breach of protocol, as though protocol were sacred, or a change in policy, as though a new president can't change the policy. That's not the issue. The issue is why China cares about Taiwan, because in the end, despite what some of the people who apparently connived to do this have said, we can't determine the consequences. We can't determine China's reaction. They will determine it. So how do they see this? From their perspective, this is not an issue of protocol at all. This is an issue touching on the fact that their country is divided. Their civil war was halted by an American military intervention on June 27, 1950, in the context of the Korean War, and the unification of the country that everybody expected was thereby frustrated. And this is a symbol of humiliation by foreign power, military intervention in China's affairs, and of course, one could add that for 22 years after that, the United States successfully denied China a seat not only in the UN, but in diplomatic relations generally around the world. We had an embargo on China that made the embargo on Iran look like nothing. And we repeatedly tried to engineer regime change. On at least 3 occasions, we threatened a nuclear attack on China before they had nuclear weapons. Anyway, from their perspective, this is a lot of baggage. If you want to understand it in American terms, imagine that in 1865 there had been no surrender at Appomattox. That Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, and the Confederate Army had been evacuated with British naval protection to the island of Cuba, where they remain in charge. And that the British, from 1865 to 1880 or thereabouts, had denied the United States the right to be represented internationally and conducted an embargo of our economy. And that we finally reached an understanding with the British, the superpower of the day, to call it off and acknowledge that actually the United States is the United States and the Confederate States of America don't exist. So, and then suddenly, and we're now in the age of Teddy Roosevelt, the British come back and want to reopen the question. Can you imagine what the American reaction would be? So I think the Chinese are actually displaying a fair amount of maturity and self-restraint and reacting to this intelligently, which is to say, in a very cautious, tentative, non-committal way. The danger is that Mr. Trump, of course, followed up his tweet on the phone call with another tweet castigating the Chinese for not telling us in advance for something or other and manipulating their currency and so forth, which was insulting and has drawn a stronger Chinese response. So we could get into a cycle of tit for tat that would be terrible, because this is not any old little country. This is a very big place with nuclear weapons and very large passions about its history. So I think the question is this, as Vice President-elect Pence said, just a courtesy, or is it something more? And there are people around the President-elect who want it to be something more. So we'll find out.
Anything for you on this, Richard?
I'd say a couple of small things. One is, for the last 36 years, we've had a very successful relationship with the People's
Taiwan
Republic of China.
and Taiwan.
And a very successful relationship with the people in Taiwan, both at the same time. We've managed it well. We've all prospered because of these relationships. They have prospered with each other because of these relationships. And, you know, if it's working, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Start number one. Number two, you know, the fact that this phone call was engineered in part by Bob Dole, who was paid $140,000 by Taiwan to put this kind of stuff together, you know, at the age of 93. God, I hope I'm really retired by then. But, you know, it doesn't smell good, right? It's pay for play. And then the third thing, though, is, you know, he's a private citizen still. He's not the president. And, you know, any good that can come out of this is that he will realize that the world is damn complicated, and he better think about it as complicated and try to deal with it that way. So, you know, welcome to the world, Mr. Trump.
Here's a further minor complication. The governor of Iowa has just issued a press statement saying how honored he is to have been nominated to be ambassador to China. Well, first of all, he has not been nominated because the president-elect does not have the ability to nominate anyone. Second, in diplomacy, there is a very useful cautionary device called agrément. A lot of diplomatic terms are French. It means that before you announce or appoint an emissary to the other side, you check with them. Is this person acceptable or not? And of course, that was not done in this case. So I think the governor of Iowa obviously doesn't understand very much about diplomacy. If this press release was cleared with the Trump transition, which it must have been, That shows they don't. And in a sense, the governor is now hostage to the Chinese, because they may take their time doing due diligence on him before they accept him. The reason is that the reason he was, quote, nominated is that when Xi Jinping was in Iowa, he met him. And he knows him, see? So that will fix everything.
Moving right along. Please.
Just along those lines, I think it's fair to say that the president-elect doesn't understand diplomacy and probably doesn't care a lot about diplomacy or care about the Foreign Service, especially given the letter that some 40 senior diplomats.
72.
I beg your pardon. Were either of you a part of those?
It is. Yeah.
My question is,
For exactly this reason.
congratulations for doing that, by the way, I appreciate the courage. My question is, the appointees who are going to be overseas, the ambassadorial appointees overseas, it's not hard to imagine them undercutting decades of your work and the State Department's work, but maybe something more than that, being rapacious, personally benefiting from the job. My question is the internal mechanisms up to checking them or keeping an eye on them? I'm talking about the OIG, I'm talking about the press corps or whatever. Are we in trouble, or will they be kept in check?
Richard might want to comment on the press corps, which I think is singularly unimpressive by comparison with past press corps. In 1947, we had 2,500 foreign correspondents for American newspapers. We're now down to 150 or so. We're not as well informed as we ought to be. But there are internal checks, but they don't survive political overrides, as the scandal of Mrs. Clinton's email server demonstrates. If any Foreign Service officer or military officer had done anything remotely like that, he or she would be in Leavenworth. That is...
Except for David Petraeus.
Well, David Petraeus was fired, but, he wasn't punished. The higher you are, the more exempt you are, apparently, from the normal operation of the law. I don't think the controls are adequate. I don't know enough about younger people in the Foreign Service these days to be sure how many people there are who will stand up and say no. I know I did that on occasion. I'm sure Richard did. I hope there are such people. But at one point, I just want to sort of dilate on your question for a moment. There are some things that the president-elect is committed to, although he seems to change commitments, so there may be a saving grace there. But, for example, moving the embassy to Jerusalem in Israel without asking Israel to do anything. Always in the past, that's been conditioned on peace between Israelis and Palestinians. Now it's unconditional, apparently. Probable result of that is the loss of some or all diplomatic relations with 57 Muslim countries. It's happened before. It happened after the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Chinese scholars are saying, well, if Mr. Trump proceeds along the course that some of these advisors he has suggest, that they will break diplomatic relations with the U.S. It's a great start to the 21st century if the two largest economies are working their way into a sort of Cold War. There are a series of things. I mean, Europeans are extremely worried about what Mr. Trump plans to do with Mr. Putin. I mean, I think he's right to want to talk to Putin, and I'm glad that he is impervious to the overwhelming anti-Putin narrative that now prevails in the United States. But the fact is we don't know what he's going to do, either in Syria or in Ukraine. He said that NATO was obsolete. That is not reassuring. And for the first time since World War II, Europeans are talking about defense arrangements that don't involve the United States. Maybe that's good. But anyway, it's all very disruptive. And this brings me to the final point in relation to China. What we learned in the Cold War, what we learned in interaction with the Soviet Union, is that the essence of escalation control is predictability. That you don't want to surprise the other side because they might misinterpret it. But now we have a president-elect who says that surprise is the essence of bargaining, and that he doesn't want anybody to know where he stands because he wants to retain bargaining flexibility. So there are a lot of contradictions that are there, and at this point we're now 44 days away from January 20th. Who's counting? And we will have to see.
An intriguing question from 2 points of view. For the second half first, the corrupt, malfeasance, whatever, renegade, wild, crazy, et cetera, ambassadors. We've had some before. But I think in this day and age, the truth gets out faster. It gets out on Facebook posts, it gets out on tweets, it gets out on, text messages, it gets out on private emails back home. It gets out on word to the press that eventually makes its way, into the blogs of Politico or somewhere else, and people jump on it and run with it. So I think it's a little harder to be a total idiot than it used to be.
Still possible.
It's still possible, yeah, but you got to be a smart idiot. The second is, what about a president that doesn't know much about foreign policy? Like say a peanut farmer from Georgia, or an actor from Hollywood, or governor of Arkansas, or for that matter, the younger Bush brother. We've had them before. People who came into office without knowing very much foreign policy. I don't think we've had sort of willful ignorance. I don't want my briefings from the intelligence community. I don't want to talk to the State Department. That bothers me. And somehow these other people, they kind of got mentors somewhere along the way. I mean, Ronald Reagan learned from Maggie Thatcher, and Bill Clinton learned from Tony Blair. George W. bless him. But, there were people around them that they appointed, that advised them, or people that they had relationships with overseas that started to form, an image of the world that they could play, that they could work with, that they could create for the United States, and a role for the United States in the world that they were seeing in their time. So, all hope is not lost, but it's fading.
There was a famous incident in the Carter administration when the governor of, I think it was North Dakota, but it may have been South Dakota, had been appointed ambassador to Singapore and was dealing with Lee Kuan Yew, who was probably the premier international practitioner of statecraft in the late 20th century. And Lee Kuan Yew mentioned something about the two Koreas. And our ambassador interrupted him and said, "What? You mean there are two of them? Why?" We had a war about that. But this is not good for the country. Even if it doesn't do any fundamental, obviously Lee Kuan Yew just decided that this guy was not somebody he was going to spend a lot of time talking to. But, you can have big mistakes. You can also have little ones that don't do you any good. And surely, in an age in which our military are ferociously competent and professional, we should demand the same of our diplomats.
I'm happy to say that our Watson Institute director is here with us today, so please, a question from Ed Steinfeld.
So Richard and Chad, I've thanked you many times privately in the past, but I'll take an opportunity publicly to thank you. Your presence in this building is, it's fantastic, but it's critical for everything we do, and this panel just demonstrates that. So I wanted to ask a quick question, probing a little bit more about that Robin Rayful story that ran in the Wall Street Journal. And this is something that happened not, under the next Trump administration. This happened under the Obama administration, Democratic administration. And if I understand the story right, it's basically saying, yeah, there's a garrison mentality with big fortress-like embassies abroad, but there's a more widespread garrison mentality that has to do with the development of the deep state, NSA, and surveillance. And I want to hear more from you both about whether you think that article, which is about one case, one individual, maybe it's an outlier, a dramatic one, but I want to hear from you both about whether, number one, that Robin Rayfield case where the FBI jumps in, there's all kinds of data that's been produced about her interactions, whether that is an outlier, of course, whether people in the Foreign Service view that case as an outlier, and what's the reaction of a Foreign Service officer? This has nothing to do, it seems, with Democratic, Republican. This is about the way the state operates, and how does it affect how the Foreign Service will operates now and into the future?
I think both of us are friends of Robin Rayfield, so we need to
Yeah.
disclose that. But go ahead, Richard, why
And
don't
I
you?
think that was her picture in one of those scenes in the film.
Yes.
At an airport, yeah.
And maybe you could say more about what the case was about.
Yeah, Robin was a very active diplomat who'd been posted in Pakistan a number of times and had a lot of friends and would go out and see them. And when she went back recently, when she was in charge of aid programs there, she actually, sort of had a house and she put on local clothes and drive a nondescript car and go out and hang out with the politicians and talk all night and drink tea. And that's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to win friends and influence people on behalf of the United States. And the FBI started finding out about this and following and listening to conversations and looking at what she was doing, and suddenly found that the things she was talking about in Pakistan were the same things that were in the classified intelligence, including the president's intelligence. And you know why? Because 80% of the material in the president's daily brief comes from the Foreign Service.
Right.
Comes from embassies, comes from American diplomats out there finding out what's going on and trying to influence the course of events. But these guys had it upside down and backwards, thinking that the truth is what we have in the intelligence and the intercepts, and she must have been out there disclosing to people what the secrets were. And so she gets, hauled in, investigated, goes through enormous pain and suffering, legal fees, et cetera, and finally, she and her lawyers get the FBI to drop a case and say they dropped the case and not prosecute for anything. So she's exonerated after a couple of years.
There have been other cases where the person that is under suspicion has been bankrupted, and the case has been left open indefinitely, thus depriving them of any possibility of employment.
Can I say one more thing?
Please.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
there's an underlying problem with this, and we've seen it not just in the current atmosphere of this sort of security state and in praise of intercepts. It's the idea that intelligence is truth. And intelligence is gossip and rumor. And even if you're listening to the minister talk to the president, they're lying to each other. They're shading the truth, they're pushing on each other for political reasons, they're sucking up to the boss, whatever. I mean, one of the reasons we got into the Iraq War is people saw this kind of stuff, heard this kind of stuff, had this kind of intelligence, and didn't realize they were lying to each other. Because people would grab pieces of raw intelligence and put it together and make a case and leak it to Judy Miller at the New York Times and get it on the front page. And everybody said, wow, isn't that cool? So a lot of people come to Washington for the first time and they see a piece of raw intelligence with all kinds of captions and restrictions and, eat before reading and all that sort of stuff written all over it. And they think, wow, this is great stuff. It was some idiot talking to some other idiot. Maybe it's somebody who knows something talking to somebody else who knows something, but it's a particular point of view. And unless you're out there talking to a lot of individuals, understanding the context and understanding why people are saying these things and what it really means, just as in our daily lives. That you're not really gonna understand what's going on, and more important, as Chad said earlier, you're not gonna understand how to influence events. So this sort of cult of intelligence is leading us into all kinds of trouble.
Intelligence is not classified information. Intelligence is information that is relevant to decision-making. That's all it is. And it can be classified, unclassified, it can be anything. And I think Richard has described the disconnect well. There is a mentality now in this country affecting anybody who has a security clearance that is very, very xenophobic. I remember when I got my Defense Department clearance to be Assistant Secretary of Defense, the fellow who came to interview me said to me, "Well, you don't know any foreigners, do you?" And I said, I have a Rolodex, 4,000 names in it, including the head of Israeli intelligence, the head of Chinese intelligence, the head of this, that, and the other, and the foreign ministers, and the prime ministers, and the presidents, and the kings, and the princes, and you can have it. But, don't ask me if I'm not going to tell you all about each one of them in my relationship with them. And just to make a point about the importance of understanding context, which our friends in the FBI don't, clearly. I can remember early on in my time as Principal Deputy for African Affairs, later Acting Assistant Secretary for African Affairs, there was an intel report that came out of Khartoum in Sudan, which at that time had a democratically elected government, which was a lot of military officers talking to each other about the coup that they were about to run against the democratically elected government. And I was called in on a Saturday, I think, to read this, and I got very alarmed, and I called another guy who was a seasoned old Foreign Service officer who dealt with Sudan for years, and he came and he read it, and he said, "Don't worry about it." He said, "Sudanese always talk about coups. It's only when they stop talking that you need to worry, because then they might actually do something." And he was right. But if you don't have that sort of feel for things, you can easily get things entirely wrong, as the FBI clearly did in Robin Rafel's case.
So I have to tell one more story, because Chaz told a story about a coup. So the day after the coup, a coup in the Philippines in the 90s, back then, Doug Mulholland comes into the senior staff meeting and turns to the secretary and says, "We had a warning this was going to happen." Everybody goes, "Whoa." And he says, "Yeah, as a matter of fact, in the last year, we've had 1,400 warnings for coups in the Philippines. We had no way of knowing this is the one that was going to happen. But 1,399 didn't."
There's a problem in the intelligence agencies that they don't value anything that they haven't paid for. And in fact, very often, if you are friends with people, they will tell you very interesting things, or by the way they react, they will indicate very interesting things. And so, but you're not paying them. So there's a tendency to discount anything that hasn't been procured through some case officer-agent relationship. Problem.
Steve, did you have your hand up? No. Oh, sorry.
I'm just curious, what U.S. newspapers would you find the most reliable, or more reliable in reporting foreign news, if any?
Probably if you ignore the editorial page, which will give you apoplexy, the Wall Street Journal. I would say they are in a class by themselves. The New York Times is now full of very distorted narratives on a wide range of issues. The LA Times is occasionally quite good. But basically, you have to do what the internet facilitates, and that is read the foreign press and keep yourself informed by trolling around and looking at the British press, which is, of course, full of papers that are wildly inaccurate, but also has some very, very serious journalism on places that they seem to cover much better than we do, Africa, Middle East, for example. Yeah, I don't think much of our press these days, frankly.
When I got my first press job, I worked for Margaret Tutwiler, who knew everything about the press, nothing about foreign affairs.
Yeah, I tutored
We
her
were-
for 2 days.
That was actually one of the best, I still cite that, was the best briefing we got in any bureau was when we went over to see Chance and went through issues you gotta worry about in Africa with us. But, the thing that struck me when I would talk to Margaret in the morning, I'd say, did you see the story in the Post today about, the West Bank? And she would say, oh, the one by Goshko. Or
Mhm.
I would say, did you see the story in the New York Times today about, Lebanon? And she'd say, oh, you mean Friedman? And she followed writers as opposed to papers. And
Mhm.
I find that I'm doing that more and more.
Right.
I'll read anything that Jonathan Landay and Warren Strobel write there in McClatchy. I'll read
Right.
everything Robin Wright writes for the New Yorker about the Middle East
Yeah.
or Iran. And so you look at the byline first. NPR is often very good as well, I have to say.
Yeah, they are,
Yeah.
generally.
I think we have time for one more question, please.
I currently work with USAID, so that's sort of
Oh, right.
what our question is. One thing that's been perplexing us is this relationship, this policy guidance surrounding development, defense, and diplomacy, and where that might go in the new administration.
I should ask my wife, who was sitting in the front row and who was going to talk about presidential transitions on Friday, and who was the assistant administrator for Asia and the Near East, both of which took heavy hits. I don't think we know. I read the paper, you probably did too, which Brian Atwood wrote, and I think it's clear that we do need to restructure things. We have too many different agencies duplicating each other's work. The relationship with the State Department remains deeply troubled because the normal instinct of people who were in my part of the profession is to want to use aid for walking around money to influence immediate issues, and that is not development. Development is a longer-term, patient process. We actually do that quite well, not just in AID, but my favorite story about that was when I discovered that the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Foreign Agricultural Service, had built a donut factory in Lagos, Nigeria. And I thought, why are we doing this to the poor Nigerians? But it was actually diabolically clever. The Nigerians didn't eat wheat. They didn't know about donuts. They loved sugar. And we were creating a market for wheat by addicting them to fat pills. So anyway, I don't know the answer. This is probably the most puzzling transition we have ever gone through, in the sense that we had a campaign and a primary season that seemed interminable, followed by a campaign in which almost no issues were discussed. The whole thing was dominated by incivility and really outlandish accusations and tweets. And it turns out, according to NPR, which I agree is a good outlet, that the guy that wrote Mr. Trump's tweets had a staff of 100, and he was sitting in Austin, Texas, writing tweets. And those tweets were targeted at the Electoral College from the beginning. These guys knew what they were doing, but they didn't care at all whether the tweets bore any resemblance to facts. This has been called the post-truth age. We will find out again. But I can't answer your question. If I were working at AID, I would be very agitated about this issue.
when it comes to diplomacy, defense, and development, I predict nothing will change, because there's too many vested interests in the
Keeping it the
Congress
same.
and around the Beltway in keeping things exactly the way they are. So you can continue to do your job.
So,
I do want to plug,
What? Well, I was just talking about that part of things, but yeah, other things might change.
I want to plug the Watson Institute event here on a Friday midday, where we have key experts talking about the transition. I believe that's here at noon, and that would be great. We also thank you to the Watson Institute for doing all this and providing a reception immediately outside, which encourage and invite everyone to. And mostly, I really want to thank Ambassador Boucher and Ambassador Freeman for sharing your experience and being willing to talk over these crucial issues. Thank you very much.